An acrid, icy wind swept through New York that morning. Clouds hung low over the city, as if wanting to squeeze it in their gray fist. Michael walked his familiar route to the office, but his heart was uneasy, as if before a storm. An unnatural silence reigned in the company's corridors, and even the coffee machine buzzed with a sense of guilt. All employees were gathered in the large conference room. The manager, who always held himself with confidence, spoke quietly and with difficulty this time, as if the words were cutting his throat. "We are forced to make a part of the staff redundant." He went on to say something about the market, about crises, but Michael barely heard. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out any explanation. In an instant, he ceased to be part of the large machine he had been working in for 10 years. He was handed an envelope with documents and a thank you for his service, a piece of paper that coldly crossed out a whole chunk of his life. Stepping outside, Michael felt the world had changed. People were hurrying somewhere, streets hummed with cars, windows glowed with Christmas lights, but for him, it was all as if behind glass. He walked home slowly, as if each step pulled him deeper into the unknown. That evening, he sat in the dark for a long time, not turning on the light. The apartment seemed too large, and the silence too loud. Michael didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He was afraid of the future and felt small in a huge, indifferent city. And yet, when he finally lay in bed, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark flickered among his anxieties. He remembered sitting on his grandmother's old kitchen, watching her knead dough when he was a little boy. At that time, the whole world seemed warm and safe. The memory was brief, but it fell into his heart like a seed, just waiting for its time to sprout. The following days flowed for Michael like a blurred watercolor canvas, where the colors had lost their brightness. He woke up in the morning out of habit. The alarm rang at 7, but now he no longer had to rush. His suit hung in the closet like a silent reproach, and his polished shoes stood by the door, waiting for an owner who no longer had a destination. At first, he tried to fill the emptiness with activity. He looked through job openings, sent out resumes, and sat for hours in front of the monitor, staring at a screen where his name and experience seemed like useless letters. There was no response, and with each day of email silence, the pressure on his chest grew. In the evenings, he sat by the window of his third-floor apartment and watched the city bustle below, under the dim streetlights. People hurried home from work, carrying bags with dinner, laughing, talking on the phone, and he sat in silence, as if cut off from the whole world. The money in his account disappeared faster than he had imagined. Every bill payment sounded like hammer blows in his mind. Doubts came at night when he lay sleepless. Maybe I'm not capable of anything anymore. Maybe all the good things are already behind me. But amidst the shadows of these heavy thoughts, a thin, almost invisible thread of light sometimes flickered. When he smelled the coffee brewing in the kitchen, or when he accidentally found old photos of himself as a boy in an apron next to his grandmother. These small memories didn't have much power yet, but they began to whisper, "Life isn't over. It has only changed its path." One evening, when anxiety weighed on him more than usual, Michael decided to make himself a simple dinner. There weren't many products in the fridge, a few vegetables, some eggs, and a piece of bread. He turned on the stove, chopped an onion, and threw it into a hot pan. And that's when something strange happened. The smell of the fried onion took him back to a distant time. His grandmother's kitchen in Texas suddenly appeared before his eyes, warm, filled with sunlight, with embroidered towels on the walls. A small boy sat on a high stool, watching his grandmother slowly and confidently knead the dough, as if her hands knew some ancient secret. He remembered her smiling and saying, "Food, Michael, is more than just taste. It's love. And if you cook with your heart, people will always feel it." The memory was so vivid that he closed his eyes for a moment and felt as if he was a boy again, the air smelling of fresh bread and crickets singing outside the window. He opened his eyes. He was back in his cramped city kitchen, but his soul suddenly felt lighter. His pan of onions wasn't a masterpiece, but for the first time in a long time, something new appeared in his heart, a small spark of joy. And this spark didn't yet know that one day it would grow into a fire that would light up the lives of many people. Since then, the kitchen began to draw him in every evening. At first, he cooked simply, without a plan: eggs, soup, baked potatoes. But every movement of the knife, every sizzle in the pan sounded to him like music he had long forgotten. Michael opened the old recipe book his grandmother had once given him. The pages were yellowed, but the smell of cinnamon and vanilla still lingered within them. He began to recreate her dishes: a thick stew, soft cornbread, spiced cookies. And each time the aroma filled his apartment, the silence no longer seemed so frightening. Cooking became like a conversation with himself. Where there had been fear and doubt, patience and mindfulness appeared. He realized that while his hands were busy, his soul was calming down. Sometimes he caught himself smiling for the first time in a long time. One day, he took a photo of a plate of his homemade ribs and posted it on Instagram. It was a simple, small post, but friends flooded him with comments. "Looks incredible. You should open a restaurant." Michael smiled, taking it as a joke. Yet deep down, he felt that this was more than just a photo of food. It was the first confirmation that something within him was still alive, something capable of touching others. In the evenings, he was no longer afraid of the dark, because he knew that as long as something was bubbling on the stove, as long as bread was rising in the oven, he wasn't alone. Food became his medicine, and he, a quiet patient, was just beginning to recover. It all started unexpectedly. One day, Michael's friend Sarah called him. Her daughter was having a birthday, and she said, laughing, "Michael, you cook so well. Why don't you make something for the party? Please, your cornbread. It's better than any cake." At first, he hesitated. It seemed strange to him. He, an unemployed man, cooking in a tiny kitchen, was now expected to provide food for guests. But in the end, he agreed. That day, he woke up early and got to work. The kitchen was like a small theater. The aroma of spices swirled in the air, ribs were turning golden in the oven, and fresh butter rolls were waiting on the table. He put in so much effort, as if he were cooking for someone very special to the party. The table looked modest, but as soon as the guests tasted his dishes, conversations hushed. Someone pushed their plate away and said in surprise, "Is this really homemade? I haven't eaten anything this delicious even in restaurants." That evening, he saw the genuine smiles and satisfied faces of people he didn't even know. And for the first time in a long time, a sense of pride awakened in his heart. It was a small step, just a birthday party. But it was the first proof that his cooking could bring happiness to others. When Michael returned home and was alone with himself, he felt something new, a strange warmth that didn't go away. And for the first time, he thought, what if this is the beginning? Despite the warm feedback from friends and acquaintances, Michael's life was still far from peaceful. Orders from his acquaintances brought in a few $100s a month, but it wasn't enough. Rent, utility bills, insurance, everything grew like an inevitable, approaching shadow point. One morning, he sat at his table for a long time, looking at his bills. The red numbers on the banking app seemed merciless. Michael understood. In a few more weeks, he would have to leave his apartment. Conflicting voices sounded in his head. One whispered, "Find any job. Agree to anything. It's safer." Another responded quietly but stubbornly, "You've already found what brings you true joy. Don't give up." That evening, he couldn't fall asleep for a long time. He stared at the ceiling and thought that life had put him in a difficult position. And then he remembered the old truck that was in his friend's garage, a pickup that was once his pride. Michael realized he would have to say goodbye to it to have a chance. The next day, he sold the truck. His heart ached. After all, every scratch on its body reminded him of years of travel and adventure. But when he felt the money in his hands, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. Now he had a small amount of capital, and he decided he would not spend it looking for his old life, but on an attempt to create a new one. With the money from the pickup truck sale, Michael could have lasted for a few months. But he decided to do something different. He invested it in something that brought him not only profit, but also joy. His apartment was transformed into a small culinary workshop. He bought a few new pots, some spices, and even a simple logo he ordered from a young designer online. This is how his small brand was born: Soul on a Plate. Michael created a simple page on Facebook and Instagram where he posted his menu: ribs with a secret sauce, cornbread, and his grandmother's cookies. He added the caption, "Homemade food with heart. Delivery throughout New York." The first orders were tiny, 2 or 3 dishes at a time. He cooked, packed them in boxes, and wrote small notes by hand. "Enjoy your meal, from Michael." He personally delivered the orders to neighbors and acquaintances, sometimes walking several blocks with bags that smelled of hot sauce. And although the earnings were small, something about the process inspired him more than any money could. Each new customer was like proof that he was doing something meaningful. His apartment was now constantly filled with the smell of vanilla, smoked meat, or fresh bread. His neighbors joked that they could find his door by the smell when they came up the stairs, and he, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like an unemployed person, but rather the owner of a small, but his very own business. At first, his clients were only friends and neighbors. But one day he received a message from an unknown woman. "Are you the Michael who makes homemade ribs? My colleague has been talking about them all day. Can I order some for Sunday?" This short message made his heart beat faster. Someone he had never seen before had heard about his dishes and wanted to try them. Gradually, there were more and more such messages. People were telling each other, "There's a guy who cooks like your grandmother is in his kitchen." His Instagram slowly began to fill up with photos of happy clients, smiling families with boxes of his food, office workers with plates of cornbread. And every time he saw these photos, a sense of pride, a quiet but genuine warmth, burned in his chest. In the evenings, he sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought. Not long ago, he was afraid of the future, and now people were finding him on their own to get a piece of the love he put into every dish. It was more than just cooking. It was a small thread that was reconnecting him to the world. One rainy evening, Michael was delivering orders himself. He brought hot boxes of ribs to an office building in Manhattan. As he was placing the bags on the table in the conference room, a man in an expensive suit approached him. "Are you the chef?" he asked, looking at the steaming dishes. "Well, yes, you could say that." Michael smiled, wiping his hands on his apron. The man took a fork, tried a piece of meat, and froze. Then he slowly nodded. "You know, I've tried hundreds of restaurants in New York, but there's something in this food that isn't there. Sincerity. Are you serious about continuing to do this?" Michael didn't know what to say. It felt strange to him. Wasn't this just dinner? But in the stranger's eyes, he saw a genuine interest. That it turned out that the man was Mark Reynolds, a well-known investor in the restaurant business. And that evening, he left Michael his business card. "Give me a call. I think you can grow much bigger than you are now in this small kitchen. I'm ready to help." When Michael returned home, he looked at the white card with the gold embossing for a long time. His fingers trembled. It was a sign. Maybe it was finally time to stop being afraid and to believe that his dream could become a real business. The cafe was quiet, almost empty. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, reflecting in the cups. Michael sat at a table, clutching Mark's business card as if he was afraid it would disappear if he let go. That he was nervous. What would I say to him? That I'm an unemployed guy who bakes rolls and fries meat in someone else's kitchen. After a few minutes, Mark appeared. In a suit, but without a tie, he looked calm and confident. He ordered black coffee and sat down opposite him. "So, Michael, tell me, what do you really want?" The question took him by surprise. But instead of being ashamed, Michael suddenly felt a warmth, as if someone finally genuinely wanted to hear him. That he began to speak about how he had always loved to cook. How as a child he stood next to his mother in the kitchen and watched her mix spices to turn an ordinary dish into magic. About how he dreamed of creating a restaurant where people would come not just to eat, but to feel at home. "I want my food to be a story, for people to feel care in every bite. It doesn't have to be a flashy place. I dream of a space where authenticity reigns, where bread smells like it did in childhood, where meat melts because it was cooked with love, not for the sake of a receipt." Mark listened carefully, slowly stirring his coffee. Finally, he said, "You know, you remind me of myself many years ago. And here's what I'll say. Dreams without money remain just dreams. But when there's someone who believes in them just as strongly, they become a reality. Let's try to do this together." At that moment, Michael felt his heart beat faster. For the first time, he imagined how his name could appear above the door of a real restaurant. And it no longer seemed like a fairy tale. They sat over a pile of papers in Mark's small office. On the table were blueprints of premises, printed rental ads, and notebooks filled with ideas. "Look, Brooklyn's cheaper. But there isn't as much traffic," Mark noted, flipping through the pages. "I don't just want a place with a stream of people. I want a neighborhood where people are looking for warmth, where a restaurant can become a part of their lives." Michael replied. He drew a diagram of the hall in his notebook. Long wooden tables, an open kitchen, the smell of fresh bread greeting every guest. I'll have a big oven, and the menu will be simple but real. Homemade ribs, fresh bread, soups that remind you of childhood. And you know what? No white tablecloths and cold formality. I want people to feel that they are loved here. Mark smiled. He liked the passion with which Michael described the future place. But he remained a pragmatist. That all sounds great, but we need to run the numbers. How much will the rent cost? How many people do you need on the team? How many dishes can you realistically cook every day without going bankrupt? And so their first argument was born. Michael spoke with his heart, Mark with a cold mind. But it was in the combination of these two elements that something new began to emerge, a restaurant that was not only soulful but also viable. That evening, as he left the office, Michael looked at the shining lights of New York and felt for the first time. This was no longer just a dream. It was a plan. They visited dozens of locations. Sterile white rooms in new buildings, neglected basements, former bars with sticky floors. But nowhere did Michael feel what he was looking for. Then, on a cold morning, they stumbled upon an old building on the outskirts of Manhattan. It was a former bakery, closed for many years. The windows were covered in dust, the wooden door creaked. Inside, it smelled of dampness, but through it all, a faint scent of old wood and memories of the bread once baked there came through. Here, Mark said skeptically, looking at the cracked walls and rusty pipes. Yes, here, Michael replied confidently, his eyes shining. He saw not dirty walls, but warm candlelight. Not broken shelves, but long tables where people were laughing. He saw the oven coming to life again, baking bread whose scent would greet guests with a whiff of childhood. This place has character. It's not new, not perfect, but it's alive. We can make a home for people here, a restaurant they can believe in. Mark was still hesitant, but he knew Michael had that rare gift of seeing not what is, but what could be. And this place, despite the cracks and cold, truly had a soul. That day, they signed the first papers. And even though their pockets were almost empty, Michael's heart was full. For the first time, he was standing in what would be his future restaurant. On the first day, when they entered the building with the keys in their hands, the air was thick with the smell of dampness. Michael ran his palm along the wall. The old brick crumbled under his fingers. The wooden floor groaned under every step. In the windows, instead of glass, there were pieces of cardboard through which the winter light seeped. We'll need twice as much money as we think, Mark grumbled, looking at the cracks in the ceiling. But it's worth it, Michael replied and smiled. Even though he only had a few $100s in his pocket and a pile of debt, the work began. They tore out old boards, took out rotten cabinets, and washed the windows. For the first few weeks, the building resembled a ruin more than a future restaurant. But Michael saw something else. Every brick, every old doorknob seemed to him like a step towards something bigger. In the evenings, he would sit on the dusty floor, sketching new designs for the hall. He imagined the smell of freshly baked bread, the laughter at the big tables, the voices of children asking for another serving of soup. These images warmed him when his hands ached from work and money disappeared faster than it came in. One day, as he was carrying out another box of trash, Michael stopped at the door and looked at the space. A ray of sun broke through a hole in the roof and fell directly in the middle of the future hall. It seemed to him that the building itself was smiling at him. "We'll manage," he whispered quietly, as if making a promise not only to himself, but also to the walls that were waiting for a new life. In the third week of renovations, Michael realized that he and Mark would never finish on their own. The walls needed plastering, the wiring needed to be replaced, and the kitchen needed a complete overhaul. But there was no money for professional workers. And then a miracle happened. One morning, an old neighbor from a nearby street came to the building. He brought his tools with him. "They say you're opening a restaurant. My father used to bake bread here. I can't stand to watch this place fall apart. Let me help too." And a few days later, more people showed up. An architecture student who wanted some practice. A young cook who dreamed of seeing a real professional kitchen. Even a local waitress who would come to wash the floors and bring hot tea after her shift. The building was brought to life by the hands of those who believed in Michael. Some painted the walls, some repaired furniture, some simply brought coffee and offered kind words of support. In the evening, when the work was done, everyone gathered together. They sat on the dusty floor, laughing and sharing stories. Michael often looked at them and felt that this was more than just a renovation. It was the birth of a family, and even though the restaurant didn't exist yet, people were already coming here as if it were their home. One of those evenings, Mark whispered, "Did you notice? We haven't even opened yet, and we already have customers." Michael smiled. He knew they were on the right path. When the kitchen was finally ready to work, even with broken cabinets and old stoves, Michael felt it was time to take the first step. Not for the whole city, not for the critics, but for those who had helped him carry out trash, paint the walls, and believe when no one else did. "We'll do a test dinner," he said. "No signs, no advertising, just for our people." They set up makeshift tables, old doors placed on wooden sawhorses and covered with white sheets. The chairs were all different, from stools to armchairs they had found in a junkyard. But it all felt cozy, as candles burned in the room and garlands made of paper by neighbors' children decorated the windows. Michael took his place at the stove. His hands trembled slightly, because this was the moment of truth. He prepared simple but soulful dishes, an aromatic soup with garlic and herbs, hot lemon-roasted chicken, and fresh bread he had baked that morning. When the smells filled the room, everyone went silent. People looked at each other and smiled, because they understood that something special was being born here. The first spoonful of soup was eaten by the same neighbor who had once brought his tools. He closed his eyes, sat in silence for a moment, and then said, "This taste, it reminds me of my childhood. My mother used to eat like this." And then others tried it, too. Laughter, shouts of joy, and thanks filled the room. Some even applauded. Michael stood by the stove and watched them, feeling that this was the heart of his dream. Not the walls, not the tables, not even the recipes, but the people who were sharing a piece of bread together. The evening ended late. No one wanted to go home. And when everyone had finally left, Michael remained in the dark room and whispered, "This is just the beginning." The morning was cool and bright. The street was still quiet, but Michael was already standing in front of the building, looking at the brand new sign he and Mark had nailed to the facade yesterday. It was simple, dark wood, white letters. Hearth and Home. That's what they decided to call the restaurant. Because every dish was supposed to be not just food, but warmth that reminds you of home. Michael couldn't tear his eyes away. He felt as if the word was glowing. Inside, his friends were already bustling around. Someone was arranging tables, someone was checking the candles, and Mark was setting out fresh napkins that a neighbor had sewn specifically for the opening. The kitchen was filled with aromas, roasted fish with herbs, hot bread, honey sauces. Just before the opening, Michael gathered everyone in the hall. He looked at his people, at those who had once come to help without expecting anything in return, and said, "We're beginning. Today, strangers will come to us. They don't know what we can give them yet, but we do. Let's make them feel at home." And at exactly 5 o'clock, the restaurant doors opened. The first to enter were a couple with their small daughter, then a group of students. Next, an elderly couple who remembered this building as a bakery. People sat at the tables, looked at the walls, and smiled at each other. When their dishes were served, the hall was filled with the same magic as at the test dinner. Laughter, thanks, eyes that shone with pleasure. Some even asked for the recipe. Michael stood in the kitchen doorway, looked at the full hall, and could barely hold back tears. It was the moment he felt that he was no longer an unemployed man with a broken dream. He was the owner of a home where every guest finds a piece of happiness, and outside the window, the first evening lights of the city were being lit above the sign, and it seemed that they were shining just for him. The very next morning after the opening, Michael woke up to an unexpected sound. Someone was laughing right under the restaurant's windows. He looked out and saw two students enthusiastically telling their friends, "You have to go there. The food is like your grandmother's, only even better." And that's how it all began. The first reviews spread through the city faster than any advertisement. Someone wrote on social media, someone mentioned it in a blog about culinary discoveries. Within a week, there was a line at the door of Hearth and Home. People waited, even if they had to freeze outside. One evening, a young journalist from a local newspaper appeared in the hall. She ordered a roasted chicken with rosemary and sat for a long time, either jotting something down in her notebook or smiling thoughtfully. The next day, an article came out on the front page. A small restaurant that restores people's faith in genuine taste and home warmth. The phones wouldn't stop ringing, and reservations had to be made in advance. Some people even traveled from other cities to try the dishes the press was talking about. Michael sometimes went out into the hall to look at the guests. His heart sang when he saw people hugging, laughing, and sharing pieces of food. The restaurant was alive, breathing, and growing. And at the end of the day, when the hall quieted down, he would stay with Mark in the kitchen. Tired but happy, they knew this was only the beginning. A half a year has passed since Hearth and Home first opened its doors, and now the lines couldn't even fit on the street. People would call a week, sometimes 2 weeks in advance to reserve a table. One evening, when the hall was packed, Mark came up to Michael and said, "It's time to think about a second location. People want more, and we can give it to them." At first, Michael was afraid. It seemed to him that expanding could break the magic. But the longer he looked at the smiling guests, the more he understood. The real magic wasn't in the walls, but in the heart, in the recipes, in the team they had created. He found an old house in the city center, spacious, with large windows through which soft light poured in the evenings. It used to be a bookstore, and Michael decided to leave a few shelves with old books. This is how the idea for the second restaurant was born, where every dinner was accompanied by stories, from recipes to legends he made up himself. When the doors of the new location opened, the line was even longer than at the first one. The city already knew his name. People whispered, "That's the man who went from being unemployed to the owner of restaurants that are changing the atmosphere of the city." That evening, standing in the new hall, Michael realized he was no longer just a restaurant owner. He was the creator of a space where people find warmth, joy, and inspiration. And for the first time, a thought crossed his mind. What if I can give this not just to this city, but to the whole country? A few years passed. Michael sometimes woke up in the morning, looked at his reflection in the mirror, and wondered, was this really him? Was it true that the man who was once laid off was now the owner of dozens of restaurants across America? Hearth and Home had become a chain. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and even small towns got their own corner of warmth and taste. Each establishment preserved the atmosphere of a home hearth. Wooden tables, the smell of rosemary, old books on the shelves. People called him the restaurateur who brought the soul of food back to America. Magazines wrote about him. Television invited him for interviews. But for Michael, the most valuable things weren't the cameras or the millions in his accounts, but the moments when he walked into any of his restaurants and saw children laughing, lovers touching hands, and friends raising their glasses. He knew that each of those evenings was another small victory. Once, during the grand opening of a new restaurant, a journalist asked him, "What does success mean to you?" Michael smiled and replied, "Success is when after your biggest loss, you find the strength within yourself to create something that brings joy to others. Money is just a consequence. The real wealth is in the people who leave my restaurant happier than when they came." That evening, under the glow of lights and the clinking of glasses, he felt that his journey had not ended with a victory, but with a new beginning. Because a dream born from defeat had turned into an empire that gave the world a taste of hope. The story of Michael teaches us a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes, life takes everything away from us to give us a chance to find our true calling. Defeat can become a door to the greatest victory. The loss of a job can be the beginning of a dream, and a small spark of hope can become a flame that lights up the whole world. So, if you ever feel that everything around you is falling apart, remember, perhaps at that very moment, your journey to something greater is beginning, and for now, close your eyes and remember, even the darkest night leads to dawn.